Hello, welcome back to my channel. I'm SpookyLith, and this is episode 5. And as you probably already guessed, in this episode we're going to be talking about something which is a big topic in the UK. I don't know about other countries as much, but I'm pretty sure that this is a conversation and an attitude that people tend to have just across the board in our countries. And that's this idea of, firstly, there being a social security, social safety net system in place financially. So that is a country which has things like unemployment benefits, disability benefits, and sick pay, government sick pay basically. And the idea is you find yourself out of work for whatever reason, then obviously the government will provide you with a very basic income to facilitate the time that you're out of work until you're able to find work. And in this country, the benefit used to literally be called Jobseekers Allowance. Yeah, Jobseekers Allowance, right? And what that, as is clued away in the name, that is an allowance given to people seeking work. Job seekers. And oftentimes these places would, well, not even oftentimes, their main function of the job centres are the jobs, what were they called? The job centre, yeah. And people, what you do is you go down to your local job centre, you do a thing called signing on, where you tell them, look, I'm out of work. They'd ask you the reason you're out of work. Now, if you've lost your job because of your doings, like you've just walked out and quit, or something along, something like that, then they actually turn you down, and they say that, they'll sign you on because it's a social benefit, and you can't really say no to anybody. However, what will happen is, because of the reason that you've lost your job being your fault, you would get immediately what's known as sanctioned, which basically meant you couldn't receive any payments. So you would sign on still, so they knew in the words aware you was unemployed and they can begin the job seeking stuff, but you wouldn't be entitled to any money for a period of time, because the reason you've lost your job was your own doing. And that period of time could be a couple of months, 6 months, it could be as long, how long's a piece of string. And you wouldn't be entitled to get any cash, but the job centre would still, and this was their function, would still help you to get back into employment. And what would happen usually is they would have a set, a bunch of jobs already sort of available for people, and it'd bring you in, assess you, see who you were, see what qualifications you've got, and then they would match you either to a job that that you'd picked through them, or you were obviously supported in going and finding a job yourself on online, or back then taking in your CV into shops and stuff. Because that's the thing for a lot of people, that once upon a time the way to get work wasn't to go online onto job sites, it was to walk into a business and hand in your resume, your CV, and hope they would get back to you. And that you'd print a bunch of them out, you'd go walking around your town centre handing out CVs to people. Fortunately, it's a lot more discreet now, and you don't have to walk up and be like, can you hand this to the manager? Now you just go online, and there's obviously websites with curated jobs and companies posting their vacancies through there, making the whole thing a bit less intimidating. And instead of walking into a shop with a stack of papers looking like a madman. So yeah, that was the job centre, and that was Jobseekers Allowance, and the whole purpose was people would lose their jobs because they'd get fired, sacked, or they'd find themselves unemployed, and the job centre would provide you with a basic allowance, not very much, and would facilitate you finding work. Yeah, so I've just opened up a tab that basically tells us sort of what the benefit income was of the period 2020 to 2021. So again, you'd go down to your job centre, tell them that you've lost your job, for whatever reason. They would assess you, find out your qualifications, kind of see what kind of things you would ideally like to do, and then they'd ask you what you'd sort of be willing to do. And then with all that, they then begin they recommend work to you while you go off and try and find a job yourself. And whichever came first, you'd take the job. And the idea is, their attitude always was something along the lines of, because growing up, it's fairly normal for the people where I'm from. Like, I didn't, it wasn't such a big deal for me, because before I got the way I got a job was through a parental connection. So I kind of went from living sort of with parents, and I moved into my friends after some things went wrong at home, and then I was living with my friend, and me and him was just sort of living at his parents' house. And then after I turned 18, it was a case of I got a job through a parental connection, and then I kind of just worked from there. So it wasn't, it's something that you saw a lot, and people sort of be in and out, because that's where it's there for. People lose their jobs no matter what they was doing, and while they're in between jobs, they were on job seekers to cover them. Unless, so there was some checks, like if you had a certain amount of money in savings, then they wouldn't pay you, because you're expected to live off your savings. However, if you had below the amount, then they would still continue to pay you. So anyway, yeah, they assess you, figure out who you are, what kind of stuff you're willing to do, and then they would have this attitude where whatever job came your way, sort of thing, like whatever was available, you was expected to take it. So because what you would have to do is, I think it was once a week, you have to go down to an appointment in person, and what they would do is they would expect you to basically provide proof and evidence that you had in fact been searching for work, and you was applying to jobs, and obviously you'd show them your replies, whatever it is you had to do to prove that you've been out in the streets or online, however you was doing it, and just basically prove you'd been applying for work. And they'd want letters, they want like a list of places you'd handed your CV, they want voicemails, anything that you had to prove that you've been job searching. They wanted to see it. And if you weren't up to standards, and they thought, you haven't tried hard enough to find work, or you turned down some kind of job that they said, well, actually that would have been a good job, then you could get sanctioned, which basically meant they'd stop your payments. So you were only entitled to this income, to this benefit, if you could basically prove you was genuinely looking for work. Or on the other side of that, if you're getting the sick pay, obviously you need a doctor's note to say you're genuinely sick. Or if you was disabled, you'd need like all the supporting documents, various specialists, etc., all of them to kind of tick the box and say, yes, this person is disabled and he's not able to do certain things, blah blah blah, affecting their ability to earn an income. So right off the bat, you can see it was a system in place not to support lazy bums who don't want to work. It's a system that's built in a way that you have to literally prove and demonstrate that you are actively looking for work, and they're expecting you to take the next thing available to get you back into work as soon as possible. So right off the bat, for a lot of these people who sort of think of benefits as a lazy bum system, in reality, the truth is, it is and has always been built in a way where a person is not only required but effectively forced to look for work. So it's not lazy. It's not just lazy bums who are on job seekers. As a matter of fact, I think for a lot of what I was seeing, you had to be quite motivated just to stay on getting that benefit, because to my memory, the people who worked in these centres were very strict. They were very, very strict, and if they suspected you weren't doing enough on your end to find work, they would sanction people, and I had friends sanctioned all the time. And I don't think people realise that when you have someone who is lazy and isn't putting in the work to find a job, that's captured by the system, and they literally get denied payments. Things have changed a bit with universal credit, which is the new system that they've upgraded to, but I'm almost certain it's the same type of thing. You still got to be actively searching for work, and they are checking, and you got to have weekly interactions with the staff, and they've got to see, as far as I'm aware, that you are genuinely trying to sort your situation out. But things have changed, and things have changed quite dramatically too, but we'll get into that. So anyway, once a person had done all these things, they were looking for work, and they were passing the checks, and everything was green. What they would be getting as an income allowance would be something to the tune of Jobseekers Allowance. So if you're over 25, you'd be getting £74 a week, and £74 a week is about £300 a month. So I think that's about right. I think now we're on universal credit, it's gone up to £323 a month. But you basically have always roughly been getting around 300 quid a month to live on. And that £300 is to pay your bills, get your shopping, and do, cover your travel and whatever else you needed, right? And then there was another component, which I think there still is, excuse me for stretching, which basically was the housing part. Now, basically, it's almost like an extension of social housing. If a person is obviously out of work and has a low income, they're able to claim a portion of their rent to be paid by the government. And this is largely considered as the other half of job seekers. So rarely would a person just go onto job seekers and nothing else. Most commonly, people would be on Jobseekers Allowance and housing benefit, and they kind of went hand in hand. One of them being to pay your bills and get you shopping, the other half being to cover your rent or your living costs. And how that worked, basically, you got roughly the same amount, around £350 a month, and you would use that to pay your rent, pay your housing costs. Now, obviously, a lot of people are probably thinking, well, 350 quid isn't going to pay my rent, and that was the case. If you was lucky enough to be renting like a 1-bedroom place and your rent was 350 a month, then you was getting all your rent paid. However, if your property was 600 a month, the government only would pay the 350, and then you'd be expected to pay the other half out of the rest of your money, and that's kind of how it worked. But the two benefits went hand in hand, so they were two separate benefits. I think on the universal credit it's all one thing now. But yeah, most people who are unemployed are getting the income, the job seekers allowance, and then they're also getting the housing part, which was kind of like an extension of the social housing system that we have over here. So this tells us that a person, your average job seeker, your single person who's found themselves out of work, is getting around £600 a month, or maybe 700 if we just say 350, because it's 323 now, and I think their housing's also 350, so that puts us at £700 a month, and that's what a job seeker typically would get to pay the bills, buy their groceries. Obviously their rent's getting paid, and then whatever they need on top, their travel costs, their car costs, potential childcare costs, and then the cost of actually, because again, another thing they consider a part of this expense is looking for work. So that would obviously be getting the clothes sorted out and getting yourself to and from job interviews, and that was it. And it's widely accepted that there's not supposed to be a leisure fund, because a person who's working for minimum wage, the most common wage here, would be getting around £1,200, £1,300 a month. I mean, I think it works out a bit less with taxes. I've been freelance for a while, so it's different freelance, but I think they're getting roughly on minimum wage around £1,300 a month. I'll just check that. So yeah, I just did a quick, I'm gonna sneeze, let me just pause it again. Sorry, I just sneezed. So based on some calculations I just did, it looks like the minimum wage is around 1,200 take home after taxes, maybe 1,100 and something. So with that, then a person's expected to pay obviously their rent, their bills, same as what a job seeker pays. However, with the minimum wage, the idea is you have some leisure money left over. You have an extra £300 ish on top of what a job seeker gets for the pleasure of working. And that's what a minimum wage worker gets. But you can see that on the job seeker stuff, you don't have that leisure allowance, meaning you can't afford to go on a trip, can't really afford nights out. You're very limited for what you can do leisure wise on unemployment benefits, excuse me, simply because there's not enough money there to cover your bills and have leisure activities. Now, this is where things get a bit spicy in the conversation, because a lot of people who are on these benefits have the opinion that you should get a bit more because leisure is a necessary part of the human experience, right? Because leisure doesn't have to mean expensive trips and whatever else. Leisure can be simple things like being able to go out for a coffee, or having a restaurant meal on a weekend, or going for some drinks. You're socializing, because at the end of the day, just as a side note, a lot of us know this, a lot of our a lot of the ways a lot of us find our careers or get into certain things is through our social connections. And if you're a person who can't afford to go to social events, it gets much harder to bump into people who know people who know people, and does make it harder to find work. So there's an argument there that there should be a leisure fund too for unemployed people for those kinds of things. But obviously, it's a hard sell in our current economic climate that unemployed people are getting that money to have leisure when they should be just looking for any old job. And that is the difference between a person who has no qualifications, who just needs any job, and a person who's got like degrees and all sorts behind them, who's going to get a job really easily. They might not even need to go into Jobseekers simply because they'll get another job so fast they won't even see a dip in their income. They might even get a job with a higher pay. But then there's other people whose only skills are things that are either really common or they just don't have any, who are going to be in that system a lot longer and struggle more, which was another function of the job centres, and I assume they still do this, is to give people training, to train people. In fact, there was one recently in the news where they were offering free lessons for truck driving because there was a truck driver shortage, and they were basically willing to pay for people to get the qualification because then obviously they'd be able to fill those roles and get those jobs. So that's the other function, is to give people with no skills some skills so they can get into the workforce and have much more likelihood of getting a job. Specialising people. And that's one thing this country is that's one of our strengths as a country, and as people emigrate, is that we come with qualifications in large percentages. And obviously people come to this country for our education system because of how accessible and how effective it is at getting qualified people out there. So that was the other function, was to qualify people. But so a person who's on these unemployment benefits is not getting the leisure component that our minimum wage worker would get. But as we also know, minimum wage is nowhere near enough. And we're saying you get... And this is the thing, right? These figures are all done on an ideal basis. So ideally, a job seeker is getting paid just enough to cover their rent and cover their bills. What we probably will see more in reality, and what I know I saw from people, is that in actual fact it's not enough to cover all those things. It's enough to cover the absolute basics, sure, like, for example, a person who's got a £600 rent, they get $350 paid, and then you take the rest out of what they're left with. So at least their rent's paid, they've got a roof over their head, but now they can't really afford to pay. They might be able to pay one more bill, and the other bills are going to have to wait, right? So people who are in these benefits are prone to falling behind with a lot of stuff, getting really big energy bills, because another thing people need is the internet. So they've got to pay for their internet access, because you can't really job seek in 2022 without internet. So they're having to pay for that, and then that might be all they can actually afford. So then they start skipping out on other bills, and people end up in debt, and it's not a good time. On the other side of that, people who are working minimum wage jobs, they're finding themselves struggling. I know people who work for minimum wage they're just paying their rent, just paying their bills, and then they just barely have enough to do a couple of the other bits and bats they need to do. And a lot of them are saying, not only that, if they do manage to save a bit of this money, if they've got cheaper bills, if they're living at home, then they're saying, well, I can't even go do these leisure activities because I'm working so much. And, there's only they can't go take a big holiday because they're not getting paid enough for a big holiday, but they're getting paid enough to go for some drinks, but they can't go for those drinks because they're either working, immediately afterwards, or they have some kind of work commitment, or they're having to make sacrifice. Basically, a person on minimum wage isn't living a free lifestyle either. They're only getting just enough to pay just what they need, and they're finding that they're having to stretch their income, and it's supposed to be enough, but it's not enough, Beautiful. So if people working for minimum wage full-time hours are struggling, then you can only imagine what a person who's on these unemployment benefits is going through. Which now brings me on to sort of the point of this episode, which is to talk about the people who are some of the most famous people in the streets of the UK, the most notorious people, and that is benefit cheats and benefit frauds and unemployment dwellers, right? We call them the council estate denizens, right? Denizens, sorry, one of those two. And that's who they are. And these are the people who live in the poorer areas here, and they're known for being on these unemployment benefits for long periods of time. They're living their lives off of them. They're often, not very pleasant people too. They've got reputations in these areas for being quite rough and prone to crime, and these are the benefit scum you might hear the UK talking about from time to time. So we've just established sort of what kind of income people on this employment benefit are getting, why they're getting it, how it sort of works, and the purpose of it. Now in the UK, we do have this problem, this endemic of people who are basically cheating the system in various ways. Now the one that comes to the consciousness of the British people, the one that we look at kind of the most and annoy a lot of us the most, are the people who basically refuse to work. They say, I'm not getting a job, I'm just going to live on benefits, right? For whatever reason, those people are the most irksome people, probably because we have such a hard work focused culture where we do say we expect everybody to sort of chip in and do their part, right? We have that mentality. So when we find someone kind of refusing to get stuck in and get working, it annoys us. It just annoys us, right? But there are a group of people basically choosing to not work and living purely off of these unemployment benefits. Now, we can already see, should be obvious to a lot of people that, let's face it, right? When a single over 25 is getting £323 a month plus getting a portion or their rent paid, and that's it. First of all, who even cares if they're choosing to live off of that? Now, I know, it's all coming from tax money, and we're going to get into that side of the problem, don't you worry. I'm aware of this. However, just looking at it from on the ground, just you're a person living your life, you don't know nothing about the government, I'm just living my life, right? And I found myself, there's a system here, it's unemployment, they give me the most bare bonesiest of minimums ever. It's just enough to get a roof over my head and keep my lights on. And some people have looked at that and said, I'm living my entire life like this, right? Who cares? And why do I say who cares? So let me give you something that obviously who cares isn't enough. So you tell me, right, a person who's looked around, including now with all the social media, all the success stories, all this stuff people are doing, all these freelance and these entrepreneurs and someone's looked at this world, all the potential for income, and said, I would rather live on 300 quid a month than to engage with any of this, right? You tell me that that's not a mental illness. Just off the bat, right off the strength, you tell me that person hasn't got something wrong with them, that they would rather live off of what we can calculate quite easily isn't enough for any kind of real life. Barely can afford to pay the bills and keep the lights on and just enough for food. They want to live their whole life like that. Fine, that's, first of all, who cares? It's not even enough money to care. They're not living lives of luxury. They're not showing up in Lambos with Rolexes and Audis and stuff, right? They're not on that income getting any of that. They're going to have just enough for a loaf of bread and some potatoes, right? First of all, who cares? Second of all, that's a mental illness. That person has a problem and they should probably be looked at by some head doctors and find out what's wrong with this person. Because they're probably, it's probably just depression, right? We've all been there. I don't want to do nothing, I just want to lay here in bed and just sulk, right? And it's kind of like that, but for a lifestyle. And it's just like, when you start looking at the numbers that these people are getting and living on, suddenly these people, these guys who just don't want to work and want to just live on unemployment benefits, they suddenly look a lot different. They don't look like people, scamming a system. They look like they're scamming themselves. Because as we know, people who are putting work in and doing what we're doing, there's money to be made. And when you start making that money, it is different. When you have all your bills paid, your fridge is full, your cupboards are full, and you can go on a holiday, things are good, things are just great, right? But when you're getting only £300 a month and you can barely afford to keep the lights on, you've got bills stacking up, debts coming against you, every week you're getting threatening letters about potentially having action taken against you, and you're working your ass off, properly working, and still having that kind of problem, then yes, that's not a good life. But as you know, that when you put the work in, and you get yourself out there, and you make smart decisions, you can be living a lifestyle that's really, really good. Especially people doing the whole freelance entrepreneur stuff, the potential for earnings huge, as we know. So the guy over here, or the woman over here who's living off £300 a month, really, 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 really not a big deal, is it? And I think that's something that this country does miss in this benefit conversation, is that the people who are the problem to the system are not the lazy sods who don't want to work, because they're living on peanuts. They're living on such a small income that, to be completely honest, and this is where we're going to get into some of the realities now, I don't think a person could live on anywhere. If you know what I mean. A person who's living that lifestyle full time is living a very poor, very decrepit life, and like I say, probably to end up in that situation has mental illness. And like I say, what I'm trying to say is those people very clearly are not the threat. They're not the enemy. Those are actually people who need that help, because if they didn't have, this is what I was getting into in the other video in episode 4. If we didn't have that safety net for those people, then they'd just be in the streets. Then they'd just be homeless people like we see in America. They'd be on the streets panhandling, trying to wash your windscreen, and it'd be a lot worse and a lot more rough. You think a council estate's rough while they're getting that? Imagine if they were getting nothing. Imagine the level of crime we'd see then. Imagine the issues we'd see then. So you can already see why for those particular individuals who just don't want to work and would rather live on minimal income, it's better that they're getting that than getting nothing, because things would be a lot worse if they had nothing at all. And at the end of the day, they're not a threat. They're not living lives of luxury. They're not going on holidays. They're not getting enough money to ever possibly do that if you factor in just rent alone. Just do the numbers on rent. Now, I know that a single bed can go for about $375, and I think that's like the actual limit of the housing benefit, or I think $350 is the limit. And if your rent is $425, $475, guess where the extra money's coming from? It's coming out of your £300. So that means you're only being left with like £170 now for a whole month. So if you crunch the numbers, you realise those people are not the threat. They've obviously got some kind of illness, and as long as they get seen to, and we have the infrastructure to deal with them, they'll be in the workplace in no time. And mainly because the system's built to force those people to find work. And the reality on the ground also is, if you speak to a person in this situation who's living on that income, they're going to tell you themselves, I really need more money, what can I do for more money? And obviously there's options of getting a job, starting a business, whatever they can do from their position. But you often hear those people who are on, for example, benefits, maybe not the ones who don't want to work now, but people who are on benefits, one thing you're going to hear a lot from them as a person who knows them is they're not getting enough money, they need more money, how can I get more money? And that's why a lot of people do find their way into work. So the people who are just saying, I don't want to work, I want to live on £300 a month, to me, they're not the problem. They're people who are probably ill. More importantly, they're not the issue. They're not scamming the system. They're just not engaging with the job seeking part, which is breaking the rules of the system, but I don't think they're scamming it. I think it's a matter of, at the end of the day, another way to put this would be, the system is built in a way that if you're not satisfying what they want to see, if you're not fulfilling, if they're looking at your case and boxes are not being checked, you have your payment stopped. So whatever's going on with this person who says, I don't want to work, I want to live on this benefit, they still have to be engaging the system in an acceptable way to even be receiving those funds. So with that in mind, yes, I think the people who choose to just stay on this system for as long as they're able to are not actually the people who are the problem. The people who are the problem, and this is the part that people are not realising and are not dealing with and are not addressing, the real benefit cheats, the real fraudsters are actually people that have money that are still claiming. Or people that are claiming at the same time as working. Now, those people fraud in the system because they're obviously using a social safety net. And they don't need a safety net because they have a job. And what they're effectively doing is double blinding the system. They're getting their income, be it minimum wage, be it a bit more. Sometimes more. Sometimes people can have a lot of money saved up and they haven't reported it, and then they claim while also having a lot of money behind them in the bank. That, you know, those are the people really cheating the system. It's not the job. who basically isn't even qualified enough to get a job, and he's probably looking for one, and he quite literally can't get hired because he's got a criminal past or because he's completely unqualified and he's not able to get her, he's not passing the courses. That person is just using the system and the system's failing them. But the person who has money behind them, the person who already has a job but then claims anyway, those are the real fraudsters. Those are the real problems, because they are abusing the system, they are cheating the system, and they're double blinding it and getting both incomes, which means if you really do the mathematics, they're getting their $1,200 a month minimum wage we'll use as the baseline. Deduct the rent, $370, $400, $500. Deduct the bills, they're left with 200, 300 quid. But then you add on the extra $350 plus the extra $323 that they're getting from the benefits. Now that person has next to $1,000 spending money and free money because their bills are paid, their rent's paid, all costs covered, food bought, and then they've got the extra money on top. So they're boosting their income by a huge amount. Now, that to me, sorry, I'm getting some text messages through. That to me is the actual frauding the system. Not the unemployed person who's actually unemployed, who's living on peanuts, but the person who's getting money and then cheating the system to ensure and boost their own income. Effectively getting wealthy from a social safety net. Instead of it being to save their lives when they would otherwise be kicked out on the street, they're using it to supplement their income and make more money. Those are your real fraudsters. Not the scummy guy, not the poor person, the yob. The person who's the problem is the wealthy person, or the person who's got money, claiming money when they're not entitled to it. For example, the most common one, is people claiming disability. Now, as far as I understand, disability benefits in this country, they're not income based, right? So that means a person can work and still claim disability, because the reason disability is paid to people isn't to cover them because they can't earn an income. It's to help cover the costs associated with their illness, right? So, for example, a person who's in a wheelchair might need special equipment. If they were working just a normal job, then that's, think about how the income's calculated. It's basically saying we've already worked out how much a healthy, normal person needs to live, but if you add in the cost of a disability, it's too much to be supported on our current income levels. So we're offering a supplement to people's income just to help them cover those extra costs that a healthy person wouldn't otherwise need to, pay. And again, it's another form of social safety net, except it's not centered around being unemployed and not earning any money. It's centered around that even while you're working, it's still not enough to cover these extra costs. And obviously, having the NHS social health system, it makes sense that we'd have a system in place to further support a disabled person once they're no longer in the hospital, who still might need special provisions to live a normal life, right? So disability benefits are not incomes tested, so a person who's working and claiming disability isn't frauding the system. That's how it's intended to work. However, most disabled people can't work for whatever reason also, or would struggle to get a job, etc. And then they would also have the unemployment element too. So again, the unemployment stuff is about job and income. The disability stuff is about additional costs regardless of income. So there are disability cheats, people claiming disability who are not disabled. It does happen. The only argument I make in favour of the disabled people or the disability system is that at the end of the day, a doctor has to look at a person, assess them. The government's doctors have to look at a person and assess them, and they all have to agree whether or not a person's condition satisfies the category for a disability. And people do lie, but at the end of the day, I think for the most part, because it's something that has to be approved by doctors, it's a lot harder to cheat, because the DWP, I don't know what the disability people are called, but they want to see letters from doctors. They want to know that a person is genuinely unwell. But we can lie to our doctors, but I think that's probably a lot harder than people give the doctors credit for too. Someone can cough and fake cough and say I'm too poorly and get a sick note. We've all been there when we wanted a day off and we needed to back it up. we've all had whiplash and all of that. But I think when it comes to something like a disability, the bar's a bit higher, and the people are very knowledgeable about people's conditions and illnesses, that I think it's a harder system to cheat than people give credit for. But it does happen. We've seen some headlines. There's a lady here who obviously was cheating the system. You know, they're trying to crack down on it in general. But yeah, again, not the biggest threat. But obviously this one is, because she's claiming money. So she's basically a healthy person walking around living a healthy, normal life, but claiming disability for an illness that isn't affecting her life and it has no additional costs, meaning she is walking away with basically a supplement to her income. I'd be interested to know if she was working and claiming disability or not. Health conditions impacted her ability to walk, but then was later caught walking around without an issue, right? So yeah, again, this is a person who's gone to the effort to fake her illness, walk around the assessment in crutches and say she was struggling to walk, and then was later caught walking around without crutches perfectly fine. So she's someone who's claiming this money who probably clearly didn't need it, because her illness wasn't impacting her life as much as she made out. But again, it is a system supported by medical professions, and I think this type of situation, I think it's possible, and it is a threat because it is people claiming money that's meant for actual disabled people, so there's a certain level of heinousness to it. But I think in this one, all we really need is that doctors do their jobs properly. Because at the end of the day, if a doctor looks a person over and says, yep, this person's too ill, I think the doctors are the ones who are responsible and should be responsible for making that decision. And that's how we can get around this type of thing. Because, let's say a doctor was able to do some kind of scan and then find no illness in a person, then they can report, well, I didn't find any evidence of this illness, and that's something a doctor would take care of, right? So, a problem, but an easily solved or an easily dealt with problem. But again, the people who are frauding the system are the people profiting from the system. People who are just using the system, because this is her again. So yeah, so there you go. So she was ill, she had something going on, and then she's had an operation that's fixed her up, she's healed up, and then she just didn't bother to tell the authorities that she was back in action. She just didn't report it. And then they've probably done a check, done a review, and then they've caught her out, and that shut down the benefits. And they probably looked into how long ago she had the surgery and how long she's been saying she's still poorly. And the system is built to catch people like that. And as we can see here, it successfully caught someone who now owes the government a hell of a lot of money. So that's the system doing its job. Yeah, someone slipped through, but they were caught out. And it looks like she was actually poorly and just got better and didn't tell them, and then they caught her anyway. So just goes to show, these systems are not as easy to cheat as people are probably led to believe, So next headline we've got here is that the DWP is planning on checking bank accounts and people's social media pages to crack down on, I'm assuming, cases like the previous one, where a person's claiming they're too poorly or they're in a certain situation, and then they've got pictures of them on nights out doing drugs and clearly not living the lifestyle that they're claiming to live. So that's a good thing. That's the system getting tighter and stricter. That's what we want, because we want everybody in the system ultimately to be job seeking and try to get back into work and getting their own income going. So it's a good thing. We want to see this kind of thing happening. Some people might argue that it's a bit too much, like why are they getting so invasive? But at the end of the day, if there is such a problem with fraud, like we were saying before, there's a prediction, there's something we've identified as a problem, and the government is doing its job to step in and try and curb that problem. And that's what we want to see from our government, regardless of who's in charge, is them reacting to these situations and dealing with them. Now, let's sort of talk a minute about why we have this system. Because at the end of the day, there's people out there, and in their eyes, in their minds, we shouldn't even have a benefit system. We should just let people who can't get an income just fall off and die and disappear and not have to worry about them, because there's this attitude of they must be a failure in some way to be in that position to need benefits in the first place. And there is a stigma it is looked negatively on, and you're not really going to catch people out in public openly talking about being on benefits unless you're in certain areas. But generally speaking, if someone's in that position, they tend to keep it quiet and then quietly get themselves another job. It's implied if a person's unemployed, we know, gotta get down to the job centre, but you're not going to see people talking too much about the details of their situation. So why do we have this in place, and why are we and what is it that we're looking at wrong about people being on these benefits? So the first part of that is an obvious answer. We have these systems to stop people from ending up in the streets. We don't want homeless people. We don't want people starving in the streets, begging and grinding like they had in the Victorian times. We just don't want that as a society, and we don't want that for our people. So this is a system that's in place so that we don't have to basically worry about people starving to death in the streets. It is a small amount of money. I know when you start factoring in the child benefit aspect of it, which basically is that if a person has a child and they're on benefits, they get an extra allowance, an extra amount to help cover the cost of having a child, and that's obviously to look after the family so that they've got enough, because obviously if they try to raise a kid on the standard amount, I think we'd find them struggling, because it's not enough money, is it? So then they get an extra amount. We can see here it's £200, £235 a month, and that extra amount is to cover the costs associated with raising a child. Now first of all, that isn't a lot of money for one child. It's an extra 230 quid. You know, it probably is enough just to keep your child fed, which should be your priority anyway, but it's not groundbreaking amount of money, and it still doesn't bring you up to a full income. However, I don't know if it still works like this, but I'm sure it does, that if a person has multiple children, then you get this amount, or you get extra amounts, depending on the number of children the family has. So, once upon a time, you would have a family that had 12 kids, and people would joke like they're just living off child benefits because they're getting this amount per child. But I think people have to remember that kids are very expensive. I don't have one. That's a choice I've made. But I know from other people around me and growing up and just in general and seeing it everywhere that kids are expensive. It's a mouth to feed. That, you know, it's not just about keeping them fed. It's about getting them clothes, getting them to school, making sure they've got all the things they need for their education, providing a full life for them, and it's not a cheap thing. And is there even a limit to the amount of money a person might need to raise their child? Well, as we know from being told no by our parents, and you telling your own kids no, yes, there is a limit on what we can do, and unfortunately we want to increase that. Well, no, and we, unfortunately that can limit the stuff that our child has access to and exposure to growing up, but ultimately we want that upper limit to be limitless. We want to be able to do anything for our family and take them anywhere, if ideally if we could. We want to always have a roof, always have the bills paid, be able to go anywhere, be able to do anything, and we want to provide our child with the most enriched life. So is there a limit to the amount of money a person needs to do that? Well, of course not. There is, however, a government sanctioned minimum, and that seems to be £235 a month. And I don't know if that's per child, or I don't really know how it works, but that is something that gets a lot of mention, which is people essentially having kids just to get that extra cash per month and then have that as their income. And in a household like that, I can only imagine that how that's working is, as they get this extra cash, instead of using it to pay the costs of their child, they raise their child as cheaply as humanly possible to borderline neglectful levels, and then pocket the rest of the cash that's supposed to be getting spent on the child. But I think this is something that, if it was happening in like a really genuine way, we'd see a lot more of these children, for example, being taken from their homes or being caught out by schools and stuff. And while it does definitely happen, I think in reality, even with a person getting the child element, the amount of money that we're talking versus the cost of actually raising not just one child but multiple children, especially if it's a single parent household, I think really they're still not getting that much money, and it's still not enough money left over that it's a truly viable way of life. And I think we can see that if we were to peer into these people's homes and slice their houses in half and see how they lived, I think we'd realise that they're actually just living in total poverty, even with the extra child element, or they're being very neglectful parents, and they might be using the bit of extra cash for extra nights out and a babysitter while the child's still living in rags and showing it to school in old clothes and stuff. So again, widely debatable, but I think, again, in this situation, the people who are really gaming the system are the people who are working and then also claiming this stuff. And I think that's where we're seeing ourselves really be cheated, because it's a obviously double bluff in the system, double blind in the system, and making a lot of money, profiting from these benefits, as opposed to just struggling through on these benefits. A person who's using these benefits and just getting by, just barely paying bills and just living a normal life and not a threat, they're just using a system designed as, they're using the system in the way that it was designed to be used. But the people who are working and still claiming are the true crooks, because they're actually making a profit. They're not just using it to get by as a safety net. They're seeing it as a business opportunity. I can profit from this system. And those are the real fraudsters. That's actually fraud. So I think we've got to be careful about who we target our rage towards. The person who genuinely is unemployed and on unemployment benefits isn't the problem, because the system's built to ensure that they only get paid if they're doing their duty, which is to look for another job. And the system's built that way. And it's only getting harder and harder to cheat, as we see by the headlines, because they're watching people and they're catching people. And it's I imagine that if you haven't been on these systems, you go try it. I mean, I know it's not that simple, but you could do it yourself. You could do it yourself with a family member and roleplay it, and just say, look, I want to know what it would be like to live on these benefits. So I'm going to give you control of my income. You're going to give me monthly the amount that a person on benefit lives on, and you're going to check my work and make sure I'm doing the stuff and make sure I'm qualifying. And you try to live like that and see what kind of a lifestyle you end up living when you limit your income in that way to those amounts, without cheating, and do it properly, and just see how long it is before you cave and need the extra money, how quickly you're asking for a loan, right? So yeah, I don't think it's the lifestyle people are worried there it is. I think the real fraudsters, once again, are the people that are cheating the system by working at the same time, because they're just making, and it's only because they're making so much money doing that they're making, that takes a £1,200 income to a £2,000 and something pound income. That's quite a significant leap, and they're doing it by falsely claiming something they're not entitled to. So, different way of looking at the benefit problem. Is it really the problem we think it is, or is it a matter of the real problem is that people are staying on these benefits so long, either because there's not enough quantity of jobs, or because they're not getting those qualifications for some reason, even though the system's designed to give them. There must be something we're doing wrong that's causing people to not be able to get the skills needed to get into work, and we should be pushing that, because again, the problem is people getting into work. If there's not enough jobs, or they haven't got the skills for the jobs, then the only way we're getting those people into work is to give them those skills. And if we have to pay a one-off fee on their behalf to get them a skill that's going to get them working for the rest of their lives, then it's worth it. Then it was never a loss. It's actually a gain in the long run. But if you have that person in that situation, getting targeted, getting all this external pressure, preventing them from getting into that lifelong job, then it's a net negative for everyone. And we're going to talk about what a net negative is in another video. But let me just... So yeah, we're going to talk about this idea that we want people to get into long-term employment and high-quality employment, something that, because again, I know that there was jobs going back in the day where people would go work in some call centre for a month, 2 months, and then the call centre would fire them, or there'd be some kind of rule, because basically they used to have these things where if let's say one company I remember, what they would have people doing is cold calling people, and what you would do is get them to fill out some kind of survey in exchange for a supposed reward, but then the reward would actually be something you had to pay for, so it was a bit of a scam. And you'd basically cold call, try get them to do a survey, and if you consistently got less than like 30 surveys a day done, then you would eventually lose the job. So it was basically performance based, and it was really scammy. People don't like being cold called. You're doing it all day, and you're more or less going to just struggle to get any done. You might get 5 done, and you know, there's a side to that we'll talk about, but you get a couple done, but nowhere near enough, right? And then after a couple of weeks of that, or a month or two, they then let you go because your performance was too low. And that was a job given from the actual job centre. That was one of their sponsored jobs, and that's where it was, right? And that's the problem of, if there's not enough jobs out there for people, what exactly do you expect people to do? It's all well and good saying get a job. It's like, yeah, are there any jobs that this person can get? Can this person get a job in their current, within, you know, where they are, with the current conditions around them? Outside of things that are very specialist or high experience jobs, are there actually enough restaurant, warehouse jobs available for these individuals? And then should they be judged for being stuck on unemployment, which is a low amount of money anyway, and probably drives them insane, while they're trying so hard to get a job and constantly getting rejected because these places either only want the specialists or just simply don't have any jobs going for them? Who's the real victim, right? So let's not forget that at the same time as there's a lot of these fraudsters, there are people using these systems who need them, who quite literally would be in the streets through no fault of their own without these systems. And that's who we're working for, that's who we're rooting for, right? That's the person we want to see find that lifetime job, because what happens when the person finds their lifetime job? Well, they become a net positive on society. They're working, supporting some kind of business, you know, building the economy locally, paying their taxes naturally, buying things, engaging in society, being patrons. They're making things happen, and they're making the wheel turn, and they can only get that wheel turning if we can get them into high quality long-term employment. Because a job that turns around once, you know, they do 1 or 2 months, get a minimal income, and then get dumped back into the system, that's ridiculous. That's not quality, and that's not helping society. That's actually bringing a negative, because the job itself is so low quality. Just cold calling people should never have to be a job, and it should, you know what I mean, like, and no one should have to do that just to get by. No one should have to become a scammer, for example. So there is one more side of benefit fraud that I'd like to talk about, and it goes in a similar vein to the people who are working and claiming, because obviously they're double blinding the system and actually profiting from these benefits as opposed to just receiving them and getting by on them, right? And the other aspect of benefit fraud that people probably don't talk about as much is those people who are living some kind of criminal lifestyle and you know, getting an income through criminal activities, but then also claiming these benefits more often than not as a way to kind of mask the fact that they're not working a job and are actually working an illegal job. Now, these people, arguably, they're the biggest ultimate you know, net negative on the whole system, and that's because they're double blinding the system, except instead of doing it to profit while working and getting that, but still paying taxes and everything, these guys are getting a tax-free income that they're never going to submit as an income, so therefore will never pay tax on it, and at the same time are also then taking from the social benefit system without putting basically anything back into it. So they're taking incomes from both sides, from workers and from the government, but they're not paying any tax on those incomes, meaning they're making maximum profit, and they're also just taking from the system without putting anything back. So, you know, these guys obviously are much harder to catch out, because generally drug dealers tend to do things discreetly, and it's much harder to notice. Like, again, some people do post this kind of thing on social media and do get caught out that way. Excuse me, but most people are not that stupid, I think. And thusly don't post that kind of thing, and therefore there's not really any way for them to be caught out. And then when they do get arrested, if they ever get caught out and they get arrested for their drug dealing stuff, you know, I don't know how common it is for them to also be penalised by the unemployment system. I don't know. So those people are the ultimate net negatives on society. They really are, in terms of when we're talking about benefit fraud and cheating the system. But again, there is again an entirely other side to the benefit system and its benefits, so to speak, that isn't acknowledged by people. And I understand, because the idea that someone's not working when you're working when I'm working is annoying. There is another reason to have a system like this in place that actually is a net positive on society, including you and including your endeavours and your businesses. And that's the obvious. It's the same reason why universal basic income is being discussed, and it's the same reason why it's a good idea. Because at the end of the day, right, there's two scenarios that happens with a person who loses their job. In one scenario, there's no social safety net, and their income stopped, they have nothing else, they go through their savings pretty quickly, whatever they've got in the bank, and then they no longer can pay their rent, they can no longer pay their bills, they fall into debt, they lose their houses, they end up in the streets, and eventually die off in the streets from some kind of sickness or from malnourishment, because at no point was there ever anything in place to prevent that from happening, and they fall all the way to the bottom and then eventually die, and the streets would be filled with all these unemployed people who can't afford to keep a roof over their heads, and there's no system in place to give them one or to put them in one, nowhere to put them. Then on the other side, you have that same individual instead losing their job and then turning into crime, and that's where things like, for example, some kind of mafia situation would arise, where people are looking for work in these other illegal organisations doing crime for them, and that's how a lot of people turn to prostitution, and there'd be a lot more drugs involved and a lot of stuff. Well, the interesting thing about drug dealing is that if a person fell far enough, they wouldn't be able to be a drug dealer, because you still have to have money to buy drugs in the first place to sell them, or to procure them in some way to sell them. So, there'd be a lot more robberies and stuff like that, but yeah, people would just turn to crime, and then there'd be more criminals around, because they need to keep a roof over their head, and of course there's going to be a lot of robberies and a lot of theft and a lot of stuff happening. So you either have them fall all the way down and become homeless, you have them turn into a life of crime and becoming hardened criminals, because keeping a roof over your head in the criminal world would be no easy task anyway, and there'd be just a lot of high risk crimes, and you probably would have a lot of people intentionally getting locked up, because at least in the prison system they're actually going to get some food and a bed, right? But more than what they'd have out in the streets. So you have a lot of that happening. There is another part to that too, which is, and then the other side now, where you have a social safety net, is that a person falls into the social safety net, gets pushed to find a job, finds a job, even if they're lower quality, is in and out of these jobs, and is still working and still has a roof over their head. They're not in the streets. They're not turning into criminals because they're getting work and they're getting skills and qualifications, and essentially will eventually be put into a longer term employment. So which of those two scenarios do we want? Do we want a system without the safety net, where there's people dying in the streets, or crime becomes a lot worse and we start getting mafias and stuff back, and people are getting shaken down in their businesses and it turns into lawlessness? Or do we want, people having a roof over their head and not in the streets, and not, panhandling, and not running up to your car and spraying it with a toilet paper and shit? We don't want that. We don't want to see that. I would imagine people generally want the system where we don't have to see people starving to death in the street. I'd like to think that. So that's where a social safety net becomes, that's where it affects us in our daily life. But more importantly than that, well, not more importantly, but on the other, and to push that further now, where we're talking about a universal basic income, not only is it better to have people who don't have to worry about, keeping a roof over their head, so they're not that desperate as people in general, but also because then they're not in the streets. But then at the same time, we as a society need people to shop at our businesses and use our services. And if you have a society where people are scraping to get by, and they don't have safety nets, and they don't have certain things in place, what you quickly find is that people no longer have money to spend at businesses. And if people can't spend at businesses go out of business, and suddenly you have more people who are now in need of social safety nets, who otherwise would have had a business, now in this same system struggling to get an income. And if we don't have that safety net, that's more people on the streets and more poverty and more crime, and they're going to turn to criminal organisations, and their main customers are going to become criminals because they're going to be the only people who have the money to do anything, and there's going to be a lot of them. So another aspect of this whole situation, and the reason we're talking about universal basic income, is the idea that, look, I start a business, I want people to spend money there. If I start a local business in my area, but my local area is full of homeless people and no one's getting any cash and people are scrambling for an income, I'm going to have way less sales than if everyone's got some kind of basic income and they all can afford just to shop at my store. I want my business in one or two of those realities, and to be honest, I'd rather have it in the one where everyone has money and they can all shop at my business, and I'm going to make lots of sales and I'm going to become wealthy because people have the money to give me. If people don't have money to pay, then I'm not going to get any wealthier, right? So that's the other part of social benefits, is that even in a rougher area, businesses can still set up shop and can still make an income, and the community, flourishes because people have money even if it's not a lot. So that's another really important aspect of benefits, that when you look at what people are doing, the people who don't want to work, the people who can't work, and all this stuff, it starts to paint a much clearer idea of what's really going on there and what the real problems and issues are, as opposed to what maybe the media likes to tell us are the problems. They're happy to call some job a benefit cheat when he couldn't cheat the system if he tried, but they're ignoring the fact that there's people with money and with incomes that claim this stuff and don't need it and are actually profiting from it. That job isn't profiting. He's wearing cheap clothes, crappy clothes, lives in a scruffy house on a scruffy street. He's not profiting from these benefits, so therefore he's not cheating anything if he's not profiting. But the people who are profiting are cheating it, and they're not even getting the spotlight. So let's keep it in perspective. The odds are very high that Yob, who has no qualifications, no skills, and needs to be in the system, because at least in this system he's got more of a chance of getting a skill than he had anywhere else that wasn't criminal. So let the system do what it's doing. It's not as bad as people think. And when we're talking about government spending, think about what the government's supposed to be doing. Where would you prefer them to be spending money? On themselves or on us? I'm so glad to see that the money's going on the people, and I hope that's where it always goes, because it's our money, and it doesn't matter where it's going as long as it's going to us, the people. And just on another note, an argument I had with someone recently regarding people on benefits long term, which is that they're going their lives on benefits, not having to work for their income, whereas everyone around them is working to pay them, right? That's how people look at it. I'm working, I pay a tax, and that tax goes to some benefit person, right? Well, here's the crux, here's the catch of that, right? That person, that individual, has not only had family members work in this country for generations, but they all have family members and extended family members and extended bloodline members all out there working, right? So when you do the mathematics on it, it's more likely that the money coming to pay for their benefits is coming from all those extended family members and all those people closer to their bloodline than your quid ever going anywhere near them, because the odds are in your extended bloodline there's people on these systems and so on and so forth. It's really a ridiculous perspective that you think your 20% income tax is even enough to pay someone's benefits. It's not. It's a tiny fraction in a big pool of stuff, and you can research where your money's going, but it's not going to Linda. Your £200 a month isn't going to Linda, the woman on benefits down the road. Your money is just going into a great big pot along with everybody else's money. And for most people living in this country, the vast majority, we've all got extended family, we've all got ancestors who have worked out, here, worked themselves to death here, so on and so forth. It's not as clear cut as you think, and you got to be more realistic than that. That person who's on benefits has a DNA line, they have a lineage of people who work and pay taxes. Don't worry about it so much. It's why we have a government. And if you really do disagree with how things are, then go research different government policies on this. Find the one that matches what you think, which potentially could be to abolish these systems, and vote for those people. if you don't like it. That's how we deal with it. Don't attack people in the streets. Don't be giving people a hard time because they're having to use these systems. Because at the end of the day, you just don't know their circumstances or why they're there. And there is a big difference between a benefit cheat, a benefit fraud, and a person who genuinely needs that system. There's a big difference, and it's important to know the difference so that when we're getting upset about this, we know who to focus on, as opposed to focusing on potentially the wrong people, who are people who just genuinely do need help, and if they weren't in that system, would actually be dying in the streets. There's a big difference between them and the person making a profit. So try to remember that in this conversation. Let's try to remember why we have this system and why it's important, and let's just keep things in perspective and realise that people having money is better for us all, because it's more money for us all through our potential businesses, and that's what we want. So anyway, it's been a pleasure, talking about this subject. Anyone who has any perspectives on this, anyone who agrees, disagrees, please do comment below. Tell me what you think. Tell me where you stand with this conversation. And yeah, it'll be interesting to discuss this in the future. So thank you for being here. It was a pleasure seeing you. I will see you next time. SpookyLith.